Today's tale from the Relic Room's crypt is not one for the squeamish. It involves two men and two horses at the Battle of Brandy Station. Two men, two horses, and a single cannonball. This shattered piece of solid shot is typical of what was fired at times by the artillery of the 1860s. On that day at Brandy Station, the damage we'll discuss was done by a piece of solid shot which was fired to ricochet off the ground and into the targets. It was Captain William Farley who was bringing a scouting report to cavalry commander, at that time Colonel, Matthew Calbraith Butler. Butler was a wealthy man and a gallant one, very brave in action, handsome, dashing, mounted on what was called a splendid chestnut bay by some, a horse called Bench Legs, which had proven over and over its great combat capacities in leaping fences and ditches, and which Butler was inordinately proud of. Farley, too, had a beautiful horse recently captured from the enemy, and the two men were faced in opposite directions as Butler received the scout's report. Well, one thing Farley wanted to report right away, and indicated by pointing across the field, the Union had set up a cannon which was actually covering the spot they were on. But Butler noted the fact, and according to one account, he turned to Farley to say, "Yes, but you know they always miss with their first shot, so continue your report, and we'll ride on after they've fired and while they're reloading." If this is an accurate account, then he paid dearly for his showboating that day. I'm going to take the next little bit from Butler's own words written down about the incident. "A shell from the enemy's gun struck the ground about 30 steps from our position in an open field, ricocheted, and passed through my right leg above the ankle, through Farley's horse, and took off his right leg at the knee. My horse bounded in the air and threw me, saddle and all, flat on my back in the road, when the poor fellow moved off with his entrails hanging out towards the clover field where he'd been grazing in the early morning, and died there, as I was afterwards informed. Farley's horse dropped in the road, terribly lacerated, and Farley fell with his head on his horse's side. As soon as we had discovered what the trouble was, my first apprehension was we would bleed to death before assistance could reach us. Well, the medical folks dashed over to the officers, and Butler, who never lacked for physical courage, was helping Farley tie a tourniquet on his leg, or what was left of his leg. Perhaps in order to tie that tourniquet, Butler had to move this holster out of the way. This is Captain William Farley's holster, which held one of his Colt Navy Model 1851 .36 caliber revolvers. And when the stretcher bearers arrived, Matthew Calbraith Butler said, "Take Farley first, he's hurt worse than I am." Farley was carried off. Apparently they didn't have a proper stretcher to carry casualties in. He was actually moved in a horse trough. And he told those carrying it to slow down and recover his leg. They picked up the leg and put it in the trough with him, they said that he embraced it and said, "Thank you, we'll stay together." Farley would expire later that evening, but Dr. Benjamin Walter Taylor of Columbia was able to save Matthew Calbraith Butler, minus his foot. Butler's foot apparently had been almost severed by the cannonball that took Farley's leg and killed both horses. And so that was the night that some said that Matthew Butler lost his foot. Well, that's not exactly true. Butler didn't lose his foot, he kept it. Oh, I'm sorry, this isn't it. But Butler had his foot embalmed, wrapped up carefully, and put in a trunk. And he would bring it home with him to Edgefield, South Carolina, there to be kept in his attic for the day of his burial. Like his friend Farley, he didn't want to be separated from any of his pieces. Some of you have heard, perhaps, that Stonewall Jackson has two graves, the one where his amputated arm was buried and the one in which his body was laid to rest. But Matthew Calbraith Butler has only one. His foot was placed in his coffin after being kept at his house for well over 30 years after the war. In fact, at one point, his children got into the attic to play with his old stuff and got into the trunk and pulled out something they didn't recognize and began tossing it back and forth, not knowing that they were literally playing football. In any case, Matthew Butler would be buried with his foot in Edgefield, but his legacy would continue in places like the Confederate Relic Room. And when you come in here to hear the talk on Halloween, remind me to show you his beautifully engraved revolver as well. For a closer look and more stories about the artifacts in our Legendary series, come and see us on October 31st at noon for the Relic Room's Legendary Lunch and Learn.